Hello, I'm Kilpo1, and today I'm covering Arc Raiders. For those of you already familiar with the game, I'll keep this brief, but for those who are not, Arc Raiders is an upcoming sci-fi PvP VE extraction shooter releasing at the end of the month and just had a weekend server stress test. And my feelings about this game are complicated, and I'm going to break down the good, the mediocre, and the bad, but what I experienced over this weekend and how it all comes together. But for those who are just here for my quick take, it's good. Really good. Though, it's a game that ultimately leaves me with a question so many games fail at recently. Why? Starting out with the good, we have performance and networking. I run a 5000X and a 3080, and for me, I experienced basically no issues at all with performance or networking. Both ran flawlessly. I ran default settings except for FOV, which I increased to 80, which I believe that's the cap, at least for 16:9. Networking wise, I did get a few indications of either jitter or packet loss, but I never experienced any interpolation or rubber banding or any clear signs of essentially bad gameplay from networking issues. Despite what you see on the screen currently, I actually really enjoyed the PvE combat, or just the PvE gameplay in this game. The enemies are deadly but have weaknesses, and they are competent but they're not omniscient. The game does a very good job of telegraphing what enemies are looking at, what they see, what awareness they're in, all natively on the units themselves. They do have the perk of leaning on robotic units that can clearly have those lights to tell you if they're aggroed or not, but I honestly just really enjoyed the PvE in this game. There's quite a few scenarios where you can clearly avoid arcs of fire if you're being careful or methodical. You can maybe bait other players into them, or you can just take your time and slowly whittle down drones by targeting their weak spots, which you'll learn over time. For weapons, there's a fair amount of different ones in the game, each with their own drawbacks and strengths. I primarily use the Rattler, though I did try the silenced pistol, auto SMG, and hand cannon, and each felt different in their own way. They had their own strengths and weaknesses that are native to the gun themselves. You couldn't really modify out with upgrades or with attachments. So the drawback and the strength of that weapon is the drawback and strength of that weapon. You can't compensate for it other than bring a different weapon, which I felt was very refreshing and forces you into a niche as opposed to a jack of all trades. If you want to go fight some robots, you might be better off with a hand cannon. If you're trying to be stealthy, you want the silenced pistol. If you really want like a middle ground, you can use the Rattler, but it's not great versus everything. And over to environmental design. I do not know a whole lot about the lore or world building of this game, but I was able to piece a lot of it together just through the world building in the actual environmental design. I could tell that we're in post-apocalypse, that robots clearly roam the surface, that we're underground, that we go to the surface to scavenge and apparently murder other people in PvP. And you can kind of get a sense of that we're like in this weird like 70s, 80s NASA punk sort of style of game, which is very cool. It's got a very interesting aesthetic to it, which I very much enjoy, and it does a good job with its environmental design, at least what I've seen so far on the first level, and there seems to be multiple of them. All right, time for some high praise. The sound design of this game is immaculate. It takes a lot of different concepts from games like Hunt Showdown and does it in its own world. I was able to pinpoint different audio cues here and there from across the map. I was able to hear things below and above me, beside me. If you enjoy taking advantage of listening to get a gameplay advantage, this is a great game for that. You can hear things in the rooms, you can hear bots moving around, you can hear things aiming, you can hear everything and use it to your advantage. I'm sure people who are really very good at this will be able to tell what gun you're using at long range from the sounds they make. That's like a clear thing from Hunt Showdown, and I'm very glad they spent the time and effort to do it here, because it really elevates both the PvE and PvP. Alright, last on our list of items under good is movement and animations. And as you can probably have seen thus far, the animations are well done, they're smooth, they're fluid. I have had no issues at all with movement in the game. There is a little bit of friction in the movement, which is important. I do think there could probably be a little bit more, but considering it's leaning into a bit more of an arcadey style of extraction shooter, I think it's ultimately fine. It is the amount of friction in the movement in the game is necessary for just being an extraction shooter. It's part of the genre is having a degree of friction. And so I think it does it well considering its more arcadey influences in that space. Alright, the Mediocore, starting with the third-person PvP. For context, I played between 12 and 15 games, around 4 hours. I had around 6 PvP fights, 2 of which were getting extract camp, and I died once there. 1 was me ratting someone, which you will see here. 1 was a large multiplayer PvP fight, around 5 players in total. 2 were me needing to jump on someone through just sheer luck or chance. And combat felt pretty quick and lethal if you were hitting your shots, and positioning felt incredibly important. Essentially, if you got caught out in the open, if you got jumped on, at least in these intro stages of the game with low gear, you get obliterated and you probably don't win those fights unless you can really quickly react, which kind of pushes the PvP into less casual range, but more on that later. The third-person peeking seemed paramount in this game, which, I mean, is a typical drawback of third-person PvP. It's ultimately why I knocked down the PvP to mid, is I find the third-person peeking to be kind of, not degenerate per se, but it does reduce the PvP a bit to just sometimes corner camping with third person. You don't have to play like that, but lots of PvP fights, if you're trying to play to win, turn out to be that. Getting the first shot, getting the first damage hit is so important that making sure you're playing corners is so thoroughly important. Now, going over extract camping, in around the 12 to 15 games, I only saw it twice. 3 times if you count a guy who took a pot shot at me from very far away. I wouldn't really call that camping though, it was just a crime of opportunity. And so in overall percentages, that's pretty low, but I will note that the times I got extract camped were the first 2 raids I played, and so the raids after that I started compensating. I started going to weirder extracts, I started doing different timings, I started doing later raids. I would leave about midway into the raid as opposed to really late or really early. And so that led to what felt like reduced chances getting camped, but the way the current extracts work makes it seem like it's going to be one of the key areas around PvP, at least with how the current regular map is set up. I haven't seen the other maps yet. They might do a better job of funneling players while they're in the actual game, but the map itself that we have here is very open, and the PvP spots are really around these extracts. For those of you who are not familiar with the game, there is alternate ways out of the map. They're called raider keys. You can buy one daily, it seems like, or craft them if you get later on in the game. Considering it felt like these raider keys were like a free get out of the raid card, I think once a day is perfectly fine. It lets casual players who do not want to engage in PvP, let them hit a hotspot and then leave safely. So I'm sure this is something they could change to in the future. The only concern I have, which I'll talk about later, is if they ever do something where they monetize these keys. I think that would be incredibly degenerate, but we'll get in that later. All right, so level design. So once again, I've only seen the first map, and the way I would describe it, or the way it feels like, is it felt like a repurposed PvE map. One of my favorite maps of all times in extraction shooters is Customs in Tarkov, despite me not generally being a hardcore PvP player in extraction shooters. And the reason why is the intensity of the choke points on that map. They're neither oppressive, they're hard to camp, but they're areas where you're naturally going to have a higher percentage chance of coming across players outside of being in loot areas. And that's essentially kind of the issue right now in this particular map, is if you're not in a loot area, the map is so open that you will rarely ever see anyone. And if you do, it's usually going to be out of utter surprise. You can't keep your wits up constantly at 100% when you're doing an extraction shooter, right? You would exhaust yourself. And so you naturally tone out a little bit when you're in the safer areas, and then you ramp back up your awareness when you start approaching these known choke points. But when the whole map is open like this, right, it just kind of creates scenarios where one side's going to get jumped on over the other, and just generally leads to random deaths. And I'm not saying it's terrible, but it's definitely mid. The map feels a bit too sandboxy. I can easily see issues with this map where the PvP players will be unhappy because they can't find anyone, and the PvE players will be unhappy because they feel like they're forced to go to the edges of the map to loot. For looting, all I could describe it as is alright or fine. The one thing about looting I did like was the breaching mechanic. Essentially, with higher value containers, you would need to breach and open them, which takes time, makes noise, and notifies either players or NPCs around you that you're doing it. It essentially means that for certain containers, you can't be a pure rat always. You might need to go kill an NPC or be wary of other players nearby. But ultimately, my two problems of why I don't like looting is that it leans pretty heavily into abundance and kind of wants you to do like mid-raid salvaging to make sure you can bring lots of loot out, it feels like. But the push and pull against that is that with match times being relatively short and encumbrance being a thing, at least at lower levels, you quickly find yourself able to hit an area, loot everything there, and then you're basically full and ready to leave in the span of a minute or two into the raid if you hit certain areas. So it just honestly feels like it leads too heavily into abundance. It feels like if you're willing to go to any of the points of interest, if you're willing to go to like really anywhere on the map at all, you're able to get a full container of loot and get out in the span of a few minutes. Alright, concerns. Just as a preface, I do not hold these against the game currently, but these are just things in the back of my mind of kind of cautionary notes or things I'm looking to see at how they handle or if they pop up in the near future after the game releases. And the first of these is potential RMT or cheaters. The cheaters are less so more of an issue. Essentially, if there is RMT, there will be cheaters just to RMT. There will always be cheaters no matter what, but the ability for RMT to exist is the drive for lots of cheaters. And for those unfamiliar, what I mean by RMT is real money transactions. Essentially, it is people handing money to people to give them stuff in-game outside of the core loop. And the reason why this is an issue is it undermines the kind of integrity of any PvP environment, and it kind of pushes the divide between PvE and PvP players more. When PvP players feel like they need to get ahead and they buy objects, or even PvE players buy objects too to get ahead, it creates loops where RMTers will go cheat to acquire those items and drive down the experience for everyone. So I did not see any cheaters in my limited playtime, which I am very happy for, but it's always the concern with an extraction shooter game that thrives on surviving. The push and pull of PvE and PvP. So, in a way, Arc Raiders feels like two games on top of each other, each one losing something so that the other can exist. For PvP, the open world layout, at least of the map I saw thus far, decentralizes players and creates voids for those looking for PvP. For PvE, the same design pushes high-level enemies into contested zones, forcing you to either skirt the edges or risk PvP in areas you'd rather avoid. Essentially, think if you're a PvE player and you want to go fight a big bad enemy you equip out for, right? Because those enemies are likely to be in those highly contested zones, you are kind of forced to opt into PvP if you want to do high-level PvE. And in a way, this creates kind of a behavior or incentive-based accidental form of skill-based matchmaking, driven by incentives rather than algorithms. But we're not going to cover that in depth right now, it's just something to keep in mind. So, something I have in the back of my head from the Darker and Darker days, or when I played Darker and Darker, is the potential opportunities for gear disparity in this game. Now, from what I've seen thus far, I saw that you get bonuses to weapons like control and magazine capacity. I didn't see things like damage. I'm hopeful that this is not a thing in this game, but it's just something I want to raise when you have gear rarity, like, you know, common, uncommon, rare, you know, the colors. It was a big problem in the Cycle Frontier, for example, of the gear disparity of no gear-based matchmaking, where sometimes you just, if you got into a fight with a person with better gear, you just had no chance. And it's always been this constant push-pull of balancing for Darker and Darker. I have no idea where they're at right now with it, but it's always been an issue in that game. And I'm hoping it's not one in here. I don't think it is, but it is something that, once again, nagging at the back of my head. All right, our last concern is the good old guy Nexon and their love of aggressive monetization. Now, I do believe they're very well aware that North America is not into monetization as deeply as the East is, but it still raises concerns of how much they're going to push the envelope in regards to monetizing the game. As long as it's cosmetic based or like skins, emotes, all that good stuff, I'm perfectly okay with it. But if they start giving gameplay functionality or bonuses for monetization, that's where the concern lies. And like I said, we're not there yet. We don't know what it's going to look like. If they sell Raider keys behind monetization, I would say that's a red line that they're crossing. That's just my personal opinion. If you disagree, that's fine. Let me know in the comments below, I guess. And now the bad. That being, why? The game is fun, but it ultimately raises the question to me of the context or the why behind it. Why am I grinding this game? It leans so heavily, if not solely, on the fundamental loop of obtaining items and using those items to obtain better items. And that loop works, for a time. But it's also why you see atrophy. When the why is left out, people will eventually break free of those dopamine loops and stop playing your game asking themselves, why was I even grinding this in the first place? It doesn't have to be deep or complex, but having that why as the root of your game is so important. You're escaping from Tarkov. You're escaping Hell and Hades. You're generating profit for Deep Rock Galactic. You can have fundamentally repetitive games that still ground the repetitiveness within the bedrock of the game. And this is why, despite all of the good things I can say about this game, Arc Raiders, I'm so hesitant about it. I might play it for fun, but I'm unsure if I can heavily invest myself in a game that can't bother to try and answer this fundamental question. And if that's all you're looking for is just a well-made, fun game, even if its staying power is fleeting, Arc Raiders is perfect for you. That's all for this video. Let me know your thoughts on Arc Raiders down below in the comments. I'm still going to wait to see how it shakes out before I invest any real time into the game, but I am curious where Embark will end up taking it.